Morning, folks. Welcome back. I trust that you had a nice and restful long weekend. Um, the weather was very nice, so I hope you had a chance to step outside for a little bit and just enjoy things. Like I said last week, we were going to start a video today, and then I'll do another video on Friday um, when we're going to start Unit 5. So, Unit 5, there's no way I would have given you this booklet. So you would find this booklet on our D2L page, resources, content, and then at the bottom it says student activity guides. It is obviously unit number 5, like I just finished saying. We are going to talk about nationalism in Canada after World War II. So that's what our focus will be for this unit, and then we'll do the same things like we did last time when we're done. But we're almost at the end. There's only one more unit after this, and then that's it. It's over. This year is done. And then, yeah. So anyways, let's just get going. So if you're following along on the presentation, there is a optional video to watch. It's 18 minutes long. It's on slide 2. You can give that a watch if you'd like. But we're going to start on slide number 3. This is page 2 of your activity booklet. We are going to we're going to talk about the motivations and state involvement or non-involvement in international affairs. We're going to focus on the question today: what is the motivation of nations in international affairs? So, we just spent a unit talking about the Second World War. So we're going to focus our attention on how that changes the world afterwards, and how the world after the Second World War has to grapple with new sort of things that are making life more difficult. So the terms that we're going to talk about today are economic stability, peace, security, and humanitarianism. So these words they become super important after the end of the Second World War, because one of the things that everybody is worried about is stability and peace, both politically and economically. So we're going to be introduce those today, and then we'll get into more of the context of it on Friday. So we're going to introduce these today, what they mean, what they look like, and then we'll move on. So this is a good way to introduce like the definitions and concepts before we get into the context. So let's begin. So what are some common motives of nation states? Of nations and states. So for the get-go, people like nations, we are motivated by things, and we're usually motivated by our needs and our wants. So obviously they're necessary for life. They're usually seen as food, water, shelter. You can even add clothing in there too. Wants are things people desire. They're not necessarily crucial to your life, but they're wants. So for example, you need food, you need water to live. If you don't have those, you won't last too long. However, you don't need like for me, for example, I don't need all these books behind me. I want them. So that's the difference, I guess. It's very simple, so I won't make that too complex. Both needs and wants are powerful motivators to encourage people. So a lot of times when things like elections roll around, when the needs are taken care of, politicians focus on what the wants of people, and they want to give them as much as possible so that they will feel that person has their best interest in them. There has been work in the field of psychology around this idea of needs and wants. So the name here, Abraham Maslow, he created a pyramid. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the image that you see on slide 3 is this pyramid. I'll put a video in the description that goes into detail about the pyramid, so just to help you out a little bit further. So basically what it is saying is it starts from the bottom and works its way up. So physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So it starts at the bottom, and essentially once you've fulfilled these needs, then you move on to the next one. So if you look in the image there, it says air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction. Once you have filled those needs, and they're secure, then you move on to the next one. So you would talk about personal security, employment, resources, health, and property, and then again, so on and so on until you get to the self-actualization, which this is something that not everyone is going to do. Some people, once they reach a certain point in the pyramid, they kind of stop. So for and sometimes they go bypass to get to certain things. So for example, we all, for the most part, have the red section covered, and then the orange one, not so much, maybe a little bit more. Certain things yes, certain things no, and then we get to the next one. Okay, yes, some of them again are more so than others, and then when we get to the desire to become the most that one can be. Well, again, you'll some people, they traverse it in different ways. They don't necessarily check off all the boxes. But this is the hierarchy of needs. These are things that when we talk about motivators and motivations, these are the things that get people to do stuff. That's why you'll see a lot of organizations in the world now that are tackling these sort of issues in countries, in developing countries, and in developed countries as well. These are the things that they talk about. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, but we'll just keep going. Another motivator is economic stability. So countries, like people, need to generate resources to support themselves. So all countries, things like taxes, if there are crown corporations or state-owned corporations, they generate revenue. So every country would like to guarantee their economic future. Every country is looking to the thing. So is looking to the future as to find out ways that they can support the country, the nation, the people. Because when we look at things like natural resources, some of them are not infinite. They are finite, which means that they will cease to exist at one point once they're all used up. So what economics and economists do is they try to figure out new ways of producing things. So high employment, having a large number of people working as possible, is a way of securing economic stability. Basically, because here's the thing. If people are working, they're producing goods. If they're working, that means they have money. If they have money, they can buy these goods, and then that goes back to the company, who then will pay taxes on it. You see what I'm saying? This sort of cycle exists in all countries. They need people to buy goods. They need people to make the goods. They pay the people to make the goods so they can go buy them. That's basic economics there. You pull one of those things out, you've got a problem. So that is essentially what economic stability is. When that wheel is broken, then you have economic instability. And that's where you see things in a lot of developing countries. The economic instability exists because those industries are owned by, let's say, multinational corporations. They can pull out their factory, and then the economy won't be able to continue. That's why things like the World Bank and the IMF, these sort of things exist to help keep those developing countries going. So they will provide with them things with loans, economic advice, these sort of things. So there are some positives, but there will be people that argue against the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, because they're seen as keeping the developing countries in a cycle of dependency. Because say they give them a loan, that means they need to pay back the loan. And that will stop economic growth and economic stability, because a lot of the revenue that would have gone to, say, helping to create more jobs and more industries is going to paying off a loan instead. So on slide 7, here's a 2-minute video on the IMF and the World Bank. I'd give that a watch, especially if you're not sure what it is. And yeah, let's just move on. So the next motivator or motivation for peoples and for nations and countries is this idea of self-determination. So we talked about self-determination a while ago in, I think, Unit 1. So generally people like to make their own decisions on what they can and cannot do with their lives. All of you, you're one more year away from graduating. That means that you're going to be deciding what you do with your lives afterwards. Now, I'm pretty sure all of you, maybe some of you don't already, which is totally fine, have an idea of what you want to do. But I'm fairly certain that all of you would like to be in the position where you can decide what you're going to do. That's very simple. Nobody wants to be told, hey, this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life, so I hope you enjoy it. If not, well, too bad anyways. You're going to do it. So people are like that. Nation states are similar, but must balance individual needs and wants against the greater good of all peoples within a nation. So remember, we'll use Canada for an example. We are not all the same. If you didn't realize that, spoiler alert. We all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different everything. So what countries have to do is they have to make sure that the self-determination of one does not trump the self-determination of the other. Because that is where you get conflict. That's where you get civil unrest, and you get sort of instability in the country. So minority groups within established nation states often have a difficult time gaining self-determination because their needs are outweighed by the majority. So when we look at, say, Canada, for example, and the slide says that First Nations groups in Canada are an example of this, is because these are small groups inside of a country full of different diverse people. When the majority benefits from something and the minority does not, their self-determination is being crushed, in a sense. We saw before the whole coronavirus pandemic thing turned the world's attention to that. Canada was dealing with a concern about oil and oil pipelines from Alberta to British Columbia, and the First Nations people's dislike of it going through their land and causing the potential for pollution and all these sort of things. That right there shows you that and when you look at it deeper, you see that the Canadian government and the court systems, they're all in favor of this pipeline instead of the First Nations people's position on this. So you can see on one side you have the economic benefit of a pipeline improving the lives of many Canadians. On the other side, you see that the First Nations people are kind of being pushed to the side, in a sense, to say, hey, your needs are not as important as ours. And that's as plainly as I can say it. And that is the difficulty with self-determination, is when you have two conflicting self-determinations, I guess we'll use that word, that exist, they come into conflict. In Canada, the First Nations people is an excellent example. If you want to talk about an example that might be a little bit more helpful, we can look at movements in the United States starting in the 1950s with civil rights. So you have civil rights movements for African Americans, led by people like Martin Luther King, advocating for the rights of African Americans, because they were arguing for things like integration, not segregation, equality in rule, and equality in resources. So if we jump back to that pyramid of the hierarchy of needs on slide 5, they were not their physiological needs, that red bar, were not being met in some situations. And if they were, it was the lesser or the scraps of things. So that is where people like Martin Luther King came in and championed things like self-determination for African Americans, a very peaceful approach to self-determination. You flip it over to another example of civil rights movements for African Americans in the United States. You see people like Malcolm X, who was a lot more aggressive, and he shifted his attention towards self-determination in a more separation of equals. rather than an integration. So there's two different things, directions that goes, and then we can look at a more modern example, things like, say, Black Lives Matter, the movement that I think it was 2015, maybe a little bit later, I don't remember, but what they did was they were advocating again for self-determination and for things like equal rights in things like law enforcement and the targeting and racial profiling of African Americans in the United States. So I have some videos. I'll put those in the description related to self-determination because it's really important to understand. And if the First Nations one example didn't help, hopefully the African American one did. And if not, I can give you some more examples. But let's move on. So again, self-determination is a huge motivator for peoples, for nations. Remember, nations not just a country, but also people within countries, and then states as well. Another motivator, probably one of the most obvious ones, is security and peace. All people want to feel safe. Nobody wants to exist in a world where any moment you could be harmed or injured or anything. I think right now is an excellent example of peace and security. Nobody wants to be sick. And everybody wants to be taken care of. So this sort of peace and security exists. In Canada, before this pandemic took place, we have a fairly good system here of peace and security. And a very simple question, I've asked this before, maybe not in our class, probably definitely not in our class, another class I have. It's simple. When you guys go to school, when you come to school, when you walk or you take the bus or you drive or whatever it is, are you concerned that a rocket is going to hit you and blow up whatever it is you're on or harm you in some way? No, I don't. I've never felt like when I drove to work that I was going to get hit by a rocket and cease to exist. In some countries, though, that is a thing. So the peace and security that we have in Canada is huge, and it's basic human security, and that's something that Canada has put into law. So in Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So your right to vote, your right to religious belief, your rights to free speech, assembly, all these things are protected by federal law. And the thing that we don't understand, maybe some of us do, but a lot of people don't understand, is that not every country has these sort of human rights that we sometimes we could honestly say take for granted. So we need to remember that peace and security, it's not necessarily a generally understood concept. We in Canada have it. In some countries they don't. We see countries that have gone through many years of civil war and civil uprisings to try to get to a point where they can introduce these sort of things. So countries like Canada often support international agreements on human rights. So the United Nations is an excellent example where countries have come together and they have agreed upon these sort of things that set out guidelines. They're not treaties, but they're just guidelines for human rights and human rights violations. And we talked about that towards the end of the Second World War in Unit 4. So peace and security is important. They do organize this idea of peace and security through alliances and organizations. So the one at the bottom here is the Transatlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This is an example of a organization that is promoting security. And if you look, there are many different kinds of subgroups within. There is the idea of the United Nations, everyone's a part of it, but underneath that there are subsections. So there is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There is one in Southeast Asia. There is one for the former Soviet states. There is one for Africa. There's one for just different alliances exist in the world. So on slide 10, you can see here, these are the NATO countries and their defense spending. So if they are in green or high, or they are spending more than 2% of their GDP, and then so on and so on and so on. So you see Canada spends 1% of its GDP towards defense, whereas the United States spends 3.6%. So NATO was created after The end of the Second World War, we're talking about like towards 1948, 1949, I think is actually when it was made, 1949. Um, there was another group, as you can see in this map. A lot of the Eastern countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and Russia are not a part of this. That's because they had their own. So Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and then East Germany would have been a part of what was known as the Warsaw Pact, and that was organized by the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union no longer exists. So some of the former Soviet satellite states towards Eastern Europe have joined NATO as a means of promoting security and defense of that organization. There's also things like the European Union as well. So, if you don't know what NATO is, there's a 4-minute video on slide 11. You can watch that. What is NATO? It would probably be worth your while to read it, or not read it, sorry, watch it, especially just to help you understand what it is exactly. But we'll move on. Another one, humanitarianism. Humanitarianism is a motivator for some countries more than others. Canada is very much involved in the humanitarian system of the United Nations. So within communities, people are often motivated to help neighbors and friends. So when we're talking about the smaller, the micro, look at this city, for example. This pandemic has shown me, and I'm sure you've seen it in some ways or other, that some people are extremely generous when motivated to do so. For example, this is a very simple example. I go for walks with my family, and near a park there is I think it's a stop sign post, and someone has put a dog, a bag for people who walk their dogs to pick up their waste, let's call it that. And they said, oh, take one and enjoy your walk. So that's this very simple example of people helping others. There's larger examples of people buying groceries for others or helping out with payments or things like that. Whenever it snows here, people will shovel sidewalks for the elderly. These are just small things. When we talk about the grander thing of like within the international community, we see motivation as well. These motivations can be in fact self-serving. Problem in one country can quickly spread to another. But there is groups that exist in countries that exist that will send in aid workers. They will send in aid itself, so food or resources or even just money, to help build up a country, a developing country. They will even take people in. So refugees are an example of this. So Canada, I think this was a few years ago, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau got into a lot of trouble for accepting in, I think it was 50,000 Syrian refugees. But this sort of refugee welcoming in program is an example of humanitarianism, because now these people are escaping war-torn countries to find security and that peace that exists in Canada. So countries like Canada, which are physically isolated from other countries, often struggle with the necessity of assisting other nations. So we are in North America separated by 2 oceans on both sides, so it is a little bit more difficult for us to be sending aid on a more regular basis. But Canada does do a fairly good job of it, of supplying aid for people. In the description, I will put a video of humanitarianism, so what it is. If you weren't too sure, you can watch the video. It comes from the European Union's Committee for Human Rights and Humanitarian Aid, I believe. So it's pretty reputable. Non-involvement, though. So we've been talking a lot about getting involved, and humanitarianism is an example of states being involved in international affairs. When we don't get involved, this is when we can see. So an example, a case study for this would be Cambodia and its mixing and integrating and its testing of ultranationalism. So Cambodia gained independence from the French Empire in 1953. The French were in Southeast Asia, so places like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was called Indochina back then. They were kicked out primarily by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese actually fought the French after World War II and were able to kick them out. Then we get the Vietnam War, and the North and South Vietnamese fighting each other. Behind the scenes, we will see the United States and the Soviet Union supporting the Soviets supporting the North and the Americans supporting the South, and we get the Vietnam War. There is actually a really good documentary on Netflix about the Vietnam War. It's actually really good. I'd recommend watching it. But you will definitely talk about it next year in grade 12. So Cambodia is kind of it's brought into the war because the North Vietnamese were using trails in Cambodia to get to the south. So the Americans are forced to bomb Cambodia from 1969 to 1973. The Vietnam War ends in 1975. But that instability in the country allows for a communist-style revolution to take over, and the leader, Pol Pot, secures control of the capital, Phnom Penh, in 1975, and it creates what's known as the Khmer Rouge. And they have this, I want to call it twisted, desire to create a country that is not industrialized, it is 100% agricultural. So they want to create an agrarian socialist state and begin a genocide to essentially create that state. So they targeted people in industry. They targeted workers. They target people who they would have deemed as the intellectuals. And this is very interesting. And I remember reading this once, that one way that they would target people is they would do so by seeing who was wearing glasses. If you wore glasses, in their opinion, you were considered an intellectual, and then you were killed just for wearing glasses. So it's very interesting. It shows you the sort of twisted nature that existed in Cambodia at this time. So approximately 1.5 to 3 million Cambodians were killed. So that's roughly a quarter of the population. And the genocide goes up until 1979, when the Vietnamese, they realize and they find out what's going on. They actually invade and they topple the Khmer Rouge government. So in 2001, they established a tribunal, so essentially a court, to try the people in charge of the government and those who were doing this act of genocide. So the trials began in 2009. So again, we've seen a lot of time go in between. So some of the higher ups, you can see their names there, were sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. Its leader, Pol Pot, dies in house arrest in 1998. He was never put on trial, though. So this shows you what happens with non-involvement. We can get these sort of, we get genocides. The Cambodian one is an example. In Africa, you have the Rwandan genocide. No involvement from the outside world until we see hundreds and thousands of people killed. So on slide 14, there is a documentary or a video of, it's 10 minutes long. It's about Cambodia and what happened. If you have the stomach for it, I would watch it. If not, don't. So that's it. So what are the motivations? So for summaries, what is the motivation of nations in international affairs? So we talked about it. We talked about our needs and wants. Humans have them, but countries also have them as well. Economic stability is another motivator. Every country wants to have stability. Self-determination. Every country wants self-determination. But remember, self-determination is really tricky, because just because a country wants doesn't mean every single person in that country wants it. So keep that in mind. Peace and security is, again, every country wants peace and security, but the question of how do you get peace and security is the big question mark there, because a lot of people will say, okay, military, but you may be peace can be mistaken for control or authoritarian control or military control, and security may just be prison. So that's, again, there's a very tricky slopes to walk there. And then humanitarianism, it's a motivator for some countries. A lot of countries are involved in it, but some not so much. And then we saw within Cambodia there was a motivation to end genocide. So that's kind of like when it gets too far, you see involvement after the fact. So that's it for today. That's it for this video. I will post another video on Friday, which will be the next, which will be continuing this unit. Please continue to work on your projects and your written responses. Some of you have done so. I have a bunch that I'm going to mark today. So if you sent yours in and didn't see it marked, I will mark it today, and we'll just keep going from there. That's it. So enjoy your day. It is a little bit rainy, but it's okay. It's still nice outside. So stay safe, and I will see you Friday.